used to think that naughty kids just needed a good spanking. But today, I'm not going to recommend corporal punishment to families. I don't even tell people to smack their kids. But I smack my kids. How can both of those things be true? And is smacking even legal in Australia? My name is Eliza Southwell, and this is how I train my children well. So here's a bit of my personal background, because everyone seems to think that's relevant. I was occasionally smacked as a child. I also remember knowing that lefty or atheist academics thought that smacking turned children into violent, delinquent adults. As a preteen, I thought that was ludicrous. I saw a clear divide between the non-smacked naughty kids and the smacked respectful kids. But I also thought that smacking was probably illegal. I didn't think I needed to know anything more about it until I found myself in a desperate situation with my strong-willed child. I realized that my discipline had to be consistent even if I was at the shops. So I looked up the law. Romans 13 verse 1 says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." It's important for Christians to be law-abiding citizens. So I wanted to look up the law, but I also wanted to look up the smacking studies that I thought I knew about, but I really knew very little about. If I was going to muster the courage to smack in public, I needed to have an answer to both of those. So here's the gist. For those of you who are time poor or just aren't familiar with looking up the law or the academic papers, here's your summary of the literature. There are 3 branches of academic research about smacking, corporal punishment. The first is the historical branch. The historical literature comes from the law academics. Basically, corporal punishment of children has been universal and popular everywhere until Sweden banned it in the 70s. And now about a third of all countries have banned it. But that includes countries like Thailand, and I don't know if you know any Thai people, but I think it's safe to say that there are still plenty of kids in that 1/3 of countries that have banned corporal punishment that still are spanked, and worse, as we'll see. The second kind of academic papers about corporal punishment is the philosophical papers. The basic argument is assault is illegal. What makes hitting your child any different? The third kind of academics that talk about this are the psychologists. They argue that corporal punishment is pretty consistently bad for kids in the long term, even if it's generally effective in the short term. Several prominent psychologists go a bit further, and they say that non-injurious smacking that doesn't cause an injury like a bruise, for young children, let's say between the ages of 2 and 5, if it's used in conjunction with other kinds of non-physical discipline, is effective and really positive for families. That's the summary of where the literature is at. Now I'm going to do a deep dive into several different studies, some literature reviews, some letters to the editor, lots of different things, and we're going to look at the details of these academic debates. Full disclosure, I'm not giving any legal advice here, and I'm not an expert in any of these fields, law, philosophy, or psychology. I'm trained as a historian, but I do understand how academics think and how papers are published. So, the legal analysis. The legal analysis focuses on, is a ban on corporal punishment actually enforceable? Because obviously this is the problem that they've had. Maybe it's enforceable in Sweden, but most of those other countries it really hasn't been enforceable. So before we introduce it to any more countries, is it actually enforceable? One of the main ways that they try and figure out if it's enforceable is by surveying attitudes to corporal punishment. Because if most people think corporal punishment is a bad idea anyway, then maybe you should just ban it and it'll be easy to enforce. But if like half your population uses corporal punishment, then it's probably not such a good idea to ban it. That's the nature of the debate. So this first article is by Pawsey Drummond. Throughout, I'm going to refer to these journal articles by the surname of their main author. This journal article just has one author, Renata Pawsey Drummond. Most of these articles have more than one, and that's just the standard of how we refer to them. Pawsey Drummond is called Help, Not Punishment, Moving On from Physical Punishment of Children. This is 2015. So we don't have access to the whole paper because it's behind a paywall and I can't afford to get access to all these papers. Generally, how researchers in law get access to these papers is they're attached to a university somehow, and the university pays to get access to these massive databases. Most of these articles are what you call open source, or freely available to anyone with an internet connection, but this first one isn't one of those. The reason that I find this article interesting anyway is that her abstract, which sets the scene for her research, also sets the scene for us about the legal situation in Australia. She says, although the physical punishment of children is overall an ineffective disciplining strategy, we'll get back to that, has adverse long-term psychological effects and carries the risk of physical punishment escalating to child abuse, Parental physical punishment is lawful in all Australian states and territories within the bounds of lawful correction or reasonable chastisement. What is considered to be reasonable is open to considerable interpretation, which further increases the risk of physical harm to children. What she's concerned about is that child abusers will say, oh, no, it's not abuse. He was just naughty. The fact that there's this huge loophole, as she sees it, for reasonable punishment for being naughty, for correcting bad behavior, she sees this as a problem that helps actual abusers to hide. Physical punishment of children also contravenes the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which Australia has ratified. We will be taking a closer look at that. Although more effective disciplining strategies such as cognitive behavioural parenting strategies are available and have been advocated by professional organisations, the vast majority of Australian parents condone parental physical punishment of children and are opposed to its prohibition. Did you hear that? Most Australians like smacking. They think it's really helpful and please don't ban it. So you might think you're alone. Maybe you were like me. When I was a kid, I thought smacking was probably illegal. Well, it's not. Most people smack their kids. Most people think it's necessary for most children to be smacked to be raised well. Predictors for this stance, the reasons that you would possibly believe that smacking was good for your child. Predictors for this stance include perceived social norms, the belief that physically punishing children is an effective disciplining strategy and a parent's right, a perceived absence of alternative parenting strategies, and a fear of prosecution if physical punishment were to be banned. Countries that have phased out the physical punishment of children have demonstrated that to encourage a shift in parental attitudes and behaviours, public awareness about the detrimental effects of physical punishment and the effectiveness of alternative disciplining strategies needs to be raised. Basically, in Sweden, they've done that. The Swedish government has told people smacking is really bad and use these other alternatives instead. And so people basically follow the law there. In other countries, the abstract doesn't tell us which countries, but Thailand, maybe. In other countries that haven't been systematic in explaining to parents, well, what are you supposed to do with your violent child otherwise? Basically, the corporal punishment ban has been pretty ineffective and people just ignore the law. Additionally, parents require support through free and convenient access to evidence-based parenting programs that promote alternative disciplining strategies. There is one in Australia that is really widespread, seems really good. We'll get to that later. And the defence of lawful correction needs to be repealed with the aim of setting a new standard as well as education rather than prosecution. So this sets the tone for the legal situation in Australia and also sets the tone from where the psychologists in particular are coming from. This next paper is by psychologists, but it's actually about the law. They're kind of outside of their lane. The authors, of which there are a ton, we're just going to call this paper Havinghurst because she's the main author. These authors are mostly psychologists. One of them's a lawyer, one of them's in child protection studies, but this is not a psychological paper. This is an activist paper, but it does tell us whether corporal punishment is legal in Australia. Going to page 2 and zooming in, we get a table. Australian, state and territory criminal law provisions permitting corporal punishment. I'm not a lawyer. I don't give legal advice. I'm just going to read this. In the ACT, there's no provision. Common law applies to permit reasonable corporal punishment. So there's nothing in particular to say, yes, you can or no, you can't, and under what circumstances. It's just, look, the law permits reasonable corporal punishment. In New South Wales, the law provides a defence to criminal proceedings regarding application of physical force to a child if the force was applied for the purpose of the punishment of the child has to have actually done something wrong, but only if A, the physical force was applied by the parent of the child or by a person acting for the parent of the child, like a grandparent, and B, the application of that physical force was reasonable, having regard to the age, health, maturity, or other characteristics of the child, the nature of the alleged misbehaviour, or other circumstances. Also, the application of physical force, unless that force could reasonably be considered trivial or negligible in all the circumstances, is not reasonable if the force is applied first to any part of the head or neck of the child, or B, to any other part of the body of the child in such a way as to be likely to cause harm to the child that lasts for more than a short period. So when we lived in Queensland, under some circumstances, I would flick my 1-year-old's cheek. I don't know if that's legal in New South Wales, so I won't be doing that in New South Wales. The part of the law in New South Wales that I think would be relevant to my circumstance there is this second part, that We don't want any application of force to any part of the head or neck of the child. But then it's this part that unless that force could be reasonably considered trivial or negligible. So, is it legal? Is it not legal? Well, I was flicking their cheeks, but also that's trivial, is it? I don't know. Anyway, I have other strategies I can use instead. I'm not going to do that in New South Wales. Please don't come after me. In the Northern Territory, the law justifies force not likely to cause death or serious harm when exercised by a parent or guardian of a child, or a person in the place of such a parent or guardian, to discipline, manage, or to control that child. Reasonable corporal punishment will not result in that child dying. That seems pretty straightforward. Queensland, it's lawful for a parent or a person in the place of a parent or for a school teacher or master, that means principal, to use by way of correction, discipline, management, or control towards a child or student, pupil, under the person's care, such force as is reasonable under the circumstances. This is interesting. I don't know of any school in Queensland that actually uses corporal punishment, but it's not illegal. South Australia, like the ACT, there's no provision. Common law applies to permit reasonable corporal punishment. Tasmania, it is lawful for a parent, again, or a person in place of a parent, to use by way of correction any force toward a child in his or her care that is reasonable in the circumstances. Victoria, again, no provision. Common law applies to permit reasonable corporal punishment. In WA, it is lawful for a parent or a person in place of a parent to use, by way of correction, towards a child or pupil under his care, such force as is reasonable under the circumstances. I don't know of any school that actually uses corporal punishment, but it's not illegal. It's specifically legal for a teacher in WA to use corporal punishment. Corporal punishment by parents and carers is not illegal in any jurisdiction of Australia. All right, now that we've cleared the air legally, what about philosophical arguments? This is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Australian government has ratified this, which means they agree to it in principle, even though it's not Australian law. If we turn to page 4, we have a list of definitions, which I think will be interesting to see where they're coming from and where they want this to go. The committee defines corporal or physical punishment as any punishment in which physical force is used and intended to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light. Most involves hitting, smacking, slapping, spanking children with the hand or with an implement. Listen to the list of implements: a whip, stick, belt, shoe, wooden spoon, etc. But it can also involve, for example, kicking, shaking, or throwing children, scratching, pinching, biting, pulling hair, or boxing ears, forcing children to stay in uncomfortable positions, burning, scolding, or forced ingestion. For example, washing children's mouths out with soap or forcing them to swallow hot spices. In the view of the committee, corporal punishment is invariably degrading. Is corporal punishment always degrading? That's their view. In addition, there are other non-physical forms of punishment that are also cruel and degrading, so they're not just picking on corporal punishment, and thus incompatible with the convention. These include, for example, punishment which belittles, humiliates, denigrates, scapegoats, threatens, scares, or ridicules the child. It goes on a bit further down. The committee recognises that there are exceptional circumstances in which teachers and others, for example those working with children in institutions like orphanages, and with children in conflict with the law, child prisons of some kind, may be confronted by dangerous behaviour which justifies the use of reasonable restraint to control it. I'm not sure dangerous behaviour only happens in institutions. I've been injured by my 2-year-old. Here too, there is a clear distinction between the use of force motivated by the need to protect a child or others and the use of force to punish. The principle of the minimum necessary use of force for the shortest necessary period of time must always apply. Detailed guidance and training is also required, both to minimise the necessity to use restraint and to ensure that any methods used are safe and proportionate to the situation and do not involve the deliberate infliction of pain as a form of control. So those are their definitions. I think what's really interesting about these definitions is to think about who they're trying to stop. It's not you. Who is it that they're trying to catch? They're trying to catch people who inflict cruel and unusual pain on their children. This next section is on human rights standards. What is their philosophical case? Before the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Bill of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, and the 2 international conventions, all of our fancy documents that we're very proud of, all of those upheld everyone's right to respect for his or her human dignity and physical integrity, and to equal protection under the law. In asserting states' obligations to prohibit and eliminate all corporal punishment and all other cruel or degrading forms of punishment, the committee notes that this document builds on that foundation. The dignity of each and every individual is the fundamental guiding principle of international human rights law. Article 37 of the Convention requires states to ensure that no child shall be subjected to torture or any other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The UN requires states to take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation, including sexual. There is no ambiguity. All forms of physical or mental violence does not leave room for any level of legalized violence against children. So the anti-smackers are like, look at this document. This is black and white. If you can't do it to an adult, you can't do it to a child. And you might think, yeah, well, that's really attractive. I like black and white. And this certainly makes it really easy to prosecute actual abusers. What it doesn't make easy is raising a strong-willed child and teaching young children to stop doing things that are damaging and destructive, but in a kind of complicated way. Once visible, it is clear that the practice directly conflicts with equal and inalienable rights of children to respect for their human dignity and physical integrity. The distinct nature of children, their initial dependent and developmental state, their unique human potential, as well as their vulnerability, all demand the need for more rather than less legal and other protections from all forms of violence. The committee emphasizes that eliminating violent and humiliating punishment of children through law reform and other necessary measures is an immediate and unqualified obligation of states parties. This is to say that Australia is under pressure from the UN to ban smacking. Furthermore, when the Committee on the Rights of the Child has raised eliminating corporal punishment with certain states, problem states, during the examination of their reports, governmental representatives have sometimes suggested that some level of reasonable or moderate corporal punishment can be justified as in the best interests of the child. The committee has identified as an important general principle the Convention's requirement that the best interests of the child should be a primary consideration of all actions concerning children. The UN says, yeah, but also our rules are black and white and easier to enforce and just do as we say, please. But the UN doesn't have any authority to force Australia to change the law. It's just pressure and international disapproval. But it's not that much international disapproval because there are plenty of big influential countries that haven't banned smacking, like the US and the UK. This isn't legal advice. This might be different from state to state in America. Don't sue me. But this is one of the things that anti-smackers complain about. Here's another paper from the philosophers. This is published in the International Journal of Children's Rights in 2017. Rowland's article is called Physical Punishment of Children: Time to End the Defense of Reasonable Chastisement in the UK, the USA, and Australia. Smacking is legal in all those countries as long as it's reasonable chastisement, reasonable correction. And Rowland is like, that's not good enough. Time to end that. Why is he saying that? Well, he repeats this story. It's an awful story. I am going to read it because it shows us exactly what kind of problem they're trying to fix when they try and ban corporal punishment. In New York, in 1874, a young girl called Mary Ellen was systematically abused by her adoptive parent, Mary Connolly. The abuse was well known, but complaints to the police brought no action as there was no specific law at the time to protect children. Her lawyer ended up prosecuting the adoptive parent using laws about the prevention of cruelty to animals. This is Mary Ellen's story in her own words. My name is Mary Ellen. I don't know how old I am. My mother and father are both dead. I call Mrs. C Mama. I have never had but one pair of shoes, but can't recollect when that was. I have no shoes or stockings this winter. I have never been allowed to go out, except in the night time and only in the yard, to use the outdoor toilet. My bed at night is only a piece of carpet stretched on the floor underneath a window, and I sleep in my little undergarment with a quilt over me. I am never allowed to play with other children. Mama has been in the habit of whipping me almost every day. She used to whip me with a twisted whip, a rawhide. The whip always left black and blue marks on my body. I have now on my head 2 black and blue marks which were made by Mama with the whip, and a cut on the left side of my forehead which was made by a pair of scissors in Mama's hand. She struck me with the scissors and cut me. I have no recollection of ever having been kissed, and I have never been kissed by Mama. I have never been taken on Mama's lap or caressed or petted. I have never dared to speak to anyone because if I did, I would get whipped. I have never had any more clothing than I have on at present. I have seen stockings and other clothes in our room, but I am not allowed to put them on. Whenever Mama went out, I was locked up in the bedroom. I don't know for what I was whipped. Mama never said anything when she whipped me. I do not want to go back to live with mama because she beats me so. Anti-smackers are trying to stop child abuse, and they can't figure out how to distinguish between that and reasonable physical punishment. It's difficult. Where would you draw the lines? These academics, Havinghurst and Rowland, they're not the problem. Child abuse is the problem that we're all trying to solve. So what is Rowland's problem with physical punishment? And could it be that there is a kind of physical punishment that exists that is not any of those things that he's worried about? Well, these are the things that he's worried about. There are a number of possible reasons as to why physical punishment is not effective as a disciplinary technique, including it does not teach children why their behavior was wrong or what they should do instead. Is it possible that I can teach them that as well? Second, it teaches children that they should behave in certain ways or risk physical punishment if they do not, rather than teaching them the important positive reasons for behaving appropriately. Is it possible that I can teach them positively how to exist in the world? Physical punishment indicates to children that it is acceptable to use physical force and aggression against another person. Can I also train him not to whack his little brother? Is that possible to do? 4. It can increase the likelihood of children behaving aggressively themselves in other social interactions. Increase the likelihood. This is academic speak for, I feel like it would do this. There's no evidence that proves that smacking a child will make him aggressive and that children that aren't smacked are not aggressive. And so they're not claiming that much. They're just saying, it can increase the likelihood. Maybe. And then also, physical punishment may teach children to link violence with a relationship that is supposed to be built on the foundation of love. Now, could it be that there is a kind of corporal punishment that exists that avoids all of these pitfalls? Can I have a warm and loving relationship with my child and smack him? Can I use physical punishment that is not violent, that isn't intended to injure or damage my child? How about punishment that's not aggressive? I'm not hostile to my child, not degrading. I think it was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It said physical punishment is inevitably degrading. My aim is not disrespect or humiliation. A pretentious child may feel disrespected, and an arrogant child may feel that their pride has been injured, but my aim is not to degrade my child. And torture, well, I think that one's self-evident. Now we're going to really get our teeth stuck into the psychological evidence. Is corporal punishment actually detrimental to children in the long run, and why? Within the anti-corporal punishment academic papers, researchers often respectfully reference academics who argue differently. Several respectable academics, not tinfoil hat academics, not disgraced, but proper psychologists, argue that smacking is different to other kinds of corporal punishment. They argue things like smacking isn't harmful, smacking shouldn't be banned, and verbal abuse is actually more like what we should be looking at. But we'll deal with the papers more generally on corporal punishment first. This article by Haslam, The Prevalence of Corporal Punishment in Australia, Findings from a Nationally Representative Survey. This is interesting because she's like, yeah, corporal punishment is bad, but let's look at how much it's actually used in Australia. So she's surveying adults because there are like ethical problems with surveying kids. She's surveying adults and saying, okay, did you experience corporal punishment as a child? Are you a parent? Do you use corporal punishment with your children? I'm not qualified to comment on how good this data is, but it looks fine. This is what she says in her discussion. For many children, these experiences of corporal punishment continued far beyond toddler and preschool years, with the mean age, the average age, of last occurrence being 11.6 years. This is important as children's reasoning skills, cognitive capacity, and self-regulation develop as they age, making them more receptive to logic-based consequences and eliminating any perceived need for physical punishment. To our knowledge, no research has examined the impact of corporal punishment or its use at different developmental stages. Well, some research has looked at smacking of toddlers and preschoolers, but it hasn't compared it to smacking an 11-year-old. It is possible that the use of corporal punishment on children in later development stages is more likely to overlap with physical abuse. This is worthy of further investigation. I would love some more investigation of this. I think that would be really interesting and helpful. My gut feeling is I don't know if I could smack an 8-year-old hard enough to actually make it mean anything without bruising them or injuring them somehow. So that would be my concern. This paper was published in 2003. It says, when they asked young people ages 16 to 24, prevalence estimates for young people were high. Lots of people that age were smacked as kids, with almost 6 in 10 young people, 58%, reporting experiences of corporal punishment in childhood. In Australia, most people of my generation were smacked as kids. They found that the prevalence of smacking among older generations was more. which I suppose you'd expect anecdotally. This paper was written in 2016. This is by Santini and Williams, called Parenting Programs to Prevent Corporal Punishment, a systematic review. Systematic review means Santini and Williams didn't go out and do their own surveys. This paper is not about an experiment they did. It's a literature review, so it reports on 9 experiments that other people did and pulls those results together to draw some broader conclusions. Literature reviews or systematic reviews are a very useful tool, used all the time. This is not suspect. They start with a summary of why they're concerned about corporal punishment. Child abuse is a risk factor for healthy development, predicting many emotional, psychological, behavioral, and interpersonal problems in adolescence and adulthood. The use of corporal punishment aims at applying physical pain to discipline or correct a behavior considered inappropriate. I would agree with that. However, recent research has found an association between a history of corporal punishment in childhood and greater risk for the occurrence of aggressive behavior, learning problems, delinquency, and domestic violence in adulthood. It seems to be, when we interview all the people in prison, that a lot of them were spanked as kids. Maybe spanking is the reason they're in prison. As a result, using corporal punishment against children is a risk factor for physical abuse and is considered by experts a modality of abuse. So Durrant and Ensom and Strauss reckon smacking is abuse. Sorry, not smacking. They reckon corporal punishment is abuse. Now, the distinction is important because these early papers that we're dealing with, they're not arguing against smacking. They're arguing against corporal punishment. Smacking is a kind of corporal punishment, but there are a lot of other kinds of corporal punishment, like Mary Ellen experienced, that I think we can all agree would result in some negative outcomes. In addition, one must promote access to strategies that effectively help parents to set limits and rules for consistent discipline, enabling them to manage and prevent inappropriate behavior without resorting to violence, and contributing thus to a healthy relationship and development of their children. Don't just say parents shouldn't use physical discipline with their kids, actually teach them what to do instead. That's great. Love that. Parenting programs are therefore relevant strategies for violence prevention, particularly by reducing maltreatment and preventing the development of violent and antisocial behavior in children. Sounds good. Now, for these 9 different experiments. These experiments range from 1 mother and child, 1 family, to 110 families. By themselves, they don't necessarily mean anything, but when we put them all together, Santini and Williams are hoping that we can start to see a picture emerge. Now, these experiments are all some kind of counseling or therapy. Some of them are individual therapy, some of them are family therapy, group therapy. If we scroll down a bit further, we get a bit more information on the families. They say, in addition, the difficulties of conducting and assessing interventions with parents who use corporal punishment to discipline their children must be stressed. It was hard to do this research. Besides involving at-risk groups like parents living in poverty with several mental health problems, the decision to accept taking part of a treatment program for the aggressive behavior against their children is a complex one and probably one of the challenges in recruiting participants. All the families here were abusive families. They recognized they had a problem with violence, and it sounds like they essentially volunteered for free therapy. I'm not sure how else they could have got them into therapy. Maybe through court orders? I don't know how they got them in. Anyway, those are the kinds of families we're talking about. And the psychologists here trying to measure whether the abuse stopped after therapy. Is therapy an effective program? Yes, it is. Great. Well, can we have some more funding to do some more therapy, please? That's what this paper is really about. So is therapy effective? What is it effective to do? Well, these experiments report decreased aggression, decreased stress, aggression, decreased anger, aggression again, decreased occurrence of corporal punishment reports. Not that they stopped corporal punishment altogether, but they didn't use it as much. Decreased depression symptoms, decreased violent and inconsistent parenting strategies, decreased neglect. So they're saying, yes, for abusive families, therapy is a great option. Please fund us more. Now to UNICEF. UNICEF is the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, and they have done this enormous 200-page statistical analysis of violence against children. And corporal punishment is just a small part of this analysis. You have physical violence that leads to injury and death in children, sexual violence, most common form of violence against children, which is corporal punishment, when children hurt one another, violent unions amongst adolescents, gangs. UNICEF's report is interesting to me, not because this report becomes our law, but because this is from the UN, Research like this influences our government as it writes and interprets the law. Again, just notice for a minute what they are concerned about. It says, all too often, however, children are being raised using methods that rely on physical force or verbal intimidation to punish unwanted behaviors and encourage desired ones. In many cases, rather than being a deliberate disciplinary choice, such violent methods are used as a result of parents' anger and frustration or lack of knowledge of non-violent responses. They're really concerned about parental anger and frustration turning into violence and hostility. And some of this research is really eye-opening. Globally, corporal punishment usually intersects with psychological aggression. Here we have a graph. Physical punishment and psychological aggression are both pervasive. So in red, you've got psychological aggression, which is like 92%. Is that right? 92% prevalent among children in Yemen, for example. Psychological aggression. So we're talking verbal abuse, threats, intimidation, to humiliate, dominate, or isolate, stuff like that. Psychological aggression is used on 92% of kids in Yemen, roughly. The kind of aggression that UNICEF is concerned about here is not prayerful smacking. In fact, very few children around the world experience only physical punishment. And the punishment on this graph isn't necessarily anything I would recognize as effective or proportionate. In this dark color, we've got both physical and psychological punishment. In yellow, only psychological. And that red, those are the proportion of children, which is like 5% maybe in Ghana. 5% of children are punished only physically. In fact, these kids are experiencing severe physical punishment. In Yemen, Egypt, Chad, over 40% of children experience severe physical punishment. Think the kind of whippings that Mary Ellen was given. This graph gives a breakdown of the different kinds of violence used on children aged 2 to 14 years. This is what discipline looks like globally. Up here we have violent discipline, and down the bottom we have non-violent discipline. Proportion of kids shouted, yelled at, or screamed at, about 70%, with some differences from the youngest to the older children, but pretty similar. Spanked, hit, slapped, shook. 40% of kids are called dumb or lazy. 20% of children are hit or slapped on the face, head, or ears. 10% of children are beaten with an object as hard as the parents could beat them. And then over here we have, 80% explain why the behavior was wrong. That was less prevalent for kids under 5, but still pretty high. That's like 72%. 50% took away privileges. 50% gave them something else to do. Great alternatives. This is what discipline looks like globally. This is one of the reasons that I don't say that I'm in favor of corporal punishment, because, if this is what you mean by corporal punishment, hitting a child with an object as hard as you can, then no, I'm not in favor of corporal punishment. This is something I need to change about the way I talk about this. I need to be much more specific about exactly what I'm in favor of and what I do with my children. What UNICEF is concerned about is when corporal punishment intersects with abuse. And that's really difficult to measure. This report compiles a range of different measures and surveys to try and get an idea of how abuse happens so they can help the people who write the laws. I want to show you this program. It's called P, Positive Parenting Program. They run free programs. They're government funded in Australia. One time, a visiting preacher was a facilitator for this program. And of course, I had lots of questions for him. I was really interested. And he was obviously really blessed by his involvement. He was keen to talk to me about it. I was pretty open with him. I tend to think if I'm not willing to be honest, then what are we even talking about? And he was initially shocked that I smacked my children. But the more we talked, the more I found that we actually had a lot in common. The P program is pretty active in Facebook advertising, and they're all about training parents to use alternatives to smacking. Positive parenting means essentially teaching your kids what's right versus punishing your kids for doing the wrong thing. They train parents in how to remove privileges and have conversations and redirect and distract. I'd call some of that punishment, but they don't. So I think essentially that it sounds like a great program. It sounds like it'll do a lot of good, but I think I can have a warm relationship with my child. I can use these positive parenting strategies and smacking as well. This paper straddles the divide between corporal punishment and smacking. And I think it really says a lot about where the waters get muddied along the way. Again, this one is just an abstract because the rest of the article is behind a paywall. Spanking and corporal punishment, parenting practices and child development, a systematic review. So again, they're not doing experiments of their own, they're not doing surveys of their own, they're just drawing together lots of little experiments all over the place, drawing together in one place so that we can draw some general conclusions. Avezum says, violence against children is a significant problem, particularly during early childhood development. Spanking and other forms of corporal punishment in child rearing have been used by families worldwide to correct children's unwanted behaviours. Despite previous studies focusing on the negative consequences of these parental practices, open questions remain. The present study aimed to systematically review the empirical studies published in scientific literature that examined the associations between parenting practices of spanking and corporal punishment of mothers and their children's behaviours and development in early childhood. In 94% of the studies, there were significant associations between maternal spanking and corporal punishment with deteriorated child behaviour and development, concurrently or later. So, this sounds terrible, right? Kids who are smacked are developmentally delayed and have worse behaviour than they started off with. Is that what this paper is saying? Well, no, it's not quite what they said. They said that there are significant associations. We don't know if it's caused, but naughty kids and developmentally delayed kids are either spanked or experience corporal punishment. As we've already established, corporal punishment includes Mary Ellen level of abuse. That really doesn't give us enough information to say that smacking is detrimental, even though they specifically did it on children 0 to 6 years old. I'm interested in the difference between developmental stages. Some good research comparing smacking, not corporal punishment, smacking 0 to 6-year-olds versus 8 to 12-year-olds. I would find that really interesting. I would love to read the rest of the article, and I'm not saying she's definitely lumping smacking in with corporal punishment all the way, but it certainly sounds like she is. There's also no suggestion that she's factoring in psychological abuse or verbal abuse that might be happening in these families. And this is quite typical of arguments against smacking. Psychologists tend to be a bit more circumspect. When academics write papers, they are generally very careful not to say something too strongly that they can't absolutely back up and stake their career on. But sometimes they slip up like this. And people who argue against smacking typically do it this way. Corporal punishment is bad. Corporal punishment and spanking is bad. So spanking must be just as bad as any other kind of corporal punishment. This next article is by Sarah Evans, The Effect of Corporal Punishment and Verbal Abuse on Delinquency, How to Avoid This. What Sarah Evans is doing in this article, which again is behind a paywall, but we have the abstract, is trying to draw a distinction between, okay, is it the corporal punishment or is it the verbal abuse that's causing the delinquency? Again, not about smacking, because how do you describe smacking in a survey? Did you have corporal punishment as a child, but you also felt really loved and valued and had a warm relationship with your parent? That's just hard to put into a survey. It's difficult to answer, and everyone will interpret that question different, and you'll just end up with a mess of results. She says, while the link between parenting and delinquency is well established, people in prison tended to have physical punishment as kids. There is less consensus among scholars with regard to the processes that account for this link. Why do prison inmates tend to have a childhood history of physical punishment? The current study had two objectives. The first was to disentangle the effects of particularly African American parents' use of corporal punishment and verbal abuse on the conduct problems of their pre-teen children, kids 10, 11, 12. The second objective was to investigate the mechanisms that explain this relationship, such as, maybe, having low self-control or hostile view of relationships whereby these harsh parenting practices increase a youth's involvement in, let's call it, problem behavior. Further, we are interested in specifically addressing how these mechanisms may operate differently for males versus females. The results indicated that verbal abuse was a more important predictor of conduct problems than corporal punishment. If you verbally abuse your children, they're more likely to end up in jail than if you just use corporal punishment with them. If you verbally abuse your children and use corporal punishment, and you can get rid of one of them but not both, get rid of the verbal abuse. The verbal abuse is more likely to be a bigger problem. Very interesting paper. The last big paper that we're going to look at is by Robert Lazzolere. He comes up a lot in the literature. It seems like he has really thrown himself into the argument to not ban smacking. This article is Child Outcomes of Non-Abusive and Customary Physical Punishment by parents. Again, this is a literature review. He's not doing his own surveys. He's just saying, look at all these different experiments that other people have done. I'm going to pull them all together and draw some broader conclusions. This article updates the only previous systematic literature review of child outcomes of non-abusive and customary physical punishment by parents. It's an interesting point he's making. Non-abusive physical punishment. He's trying to make a distinction between, Mary Ellen style corporal punishment, beating a child black and blue, and non-abusive physical punishment, like smacking a child's bum and not leaving a mark. And he's making the point, just in this one sentence, that not many researchers are out there saying, hang on, physical punishment isn't always abusive, and Lazare wants to protect people like me, who have warm, loving relationships with their children who they also smack. No one else is really thinking about us. The debate on whether to ban corporal punishment or not is not about people like us. It's about abusers and how to protect children. They're not interested in non-abusive smackers. But Lazare and others like him are responding to the pressure for a ban. They're saying, hang on, we can't just turn these non-abusive parents into criminals and remove their children. He says, all 6 studies that used clinical samples and the other 3 found beneficial outcomes, such as reduced non-compliance and fighting, primarily when non-abusive spanking was used to back up milder disciplinary tactics in 2 to 6-year-olds. 5 of 8 longitudinal studies that controlled for initial child misbehavior found predominantly detrimental outcomes of spanking, but these detrimental outcomes were primarily due to overtly frequent use of physical punishment. Basically, he's making a case here for smacking 2 to 6-year-olds as long as you're not smacking them too often and as long as you're keeping an eye on whether it's actually effective for your child. Furthermore, apparently detrimental outcomes have been found for every alternative disciplinary tactic when investigated with similar analyses. When children are already violent and out of control, even at 2 years old, nothing is going to change them overnight. Such detrimental associations of frequent use of any disciplinary tactic may be due to residual confounding from initial child misbehavior, so kids just don't change very quickly. Specific findings suggest discriminations between effective and counterproductive physical punishment with young children. More research is needed to clarify the role of spanking and alternative disciplinary tactics in control system aspects of parental discipline. So he's saying, look, we looked at these 15 papers or so. It looks like across the board for these papers, smacking was a good thing. And when smacking was a bad thing, it was obviously because they were smacking way too much. So you can't make a case against non-injurious smacking from the papers that have actually been done. The last thing I'd like to have a look at is not an academic paper. It's not a research paper. It's a series of letters to the editor of an academic journal. And these academics are having a conversation about some research results. Waterston writes a paper. 4 other researchers pile on, say, you did this great. Some holes here, not sure about that. Have you thought about this other paper? And then Waterston comes back and responds to their concerns. Lazare shows up. He says, weak evidence for a smacking ban. A ban of a medical intervention would never be supported on the basis of such meagre evidence as used by Waterston to support a ban of the parental intervention of smacking. Significant adverse effects and a failure to learn the desired behavior were based on a literature review that is unpublished. We don't know how good the evidence is, and that includes studies that included severe types of corporal punishment, such as beating with a stick, still hurt the next day, burning, and using a knife or gun. In the only published review in 1996 of child outcomes of non-abusive or customary physical punishment, only 8 studies could disentangle the causal effects of smacking. All 8 studies, including 4 randomized clinical trials, found that non-abusive smacking benefited children, was backed up by milder disciplinary tactics with children aged 2 to 6 years. This is what he published in his paper. He's saying, look here, Waterston, look at my paper. My paper is epic. You should learn from me. Smacking then makes milder tactics more effective, not harder to use, as concluded by Waterston. The 1994 Swedish survey, Sweden was the first country to ban corporal punishment in the 70s, 1994 Swedish survey also found that corporal punishment of teenagers was as prevalent after the 1979 ban as in previous generations, and that overall the incidence of corporal punishment had decreased little. So even Sweden had trouble enforcing a ban in the beginning. The most difficult puzzle for parents and professionals concerns effective methods of decreasing misbehavior. 18 studies in the 1996 review investigated alternative disciplinary tactics as well as smacking. Only grounding was more effective than smacking in 2 studies of older children. In contrast, 9 alternatives were associated with more detrimental outcomes in children than was smacking. Smacking isn't pleasant, he's saying, but if you want to decrease misbehavior, decrease violence, smacking is probably one of the best things you have. Don't take that away from parents. Parents need to be empowered with more effective alternatives, not disempowered by premature bans on traditional disciplinary tactics. Who's next to pile on? Trumbull says you can't just ban corporal punishment. Definitions. Corporal punishment was defined as bodily punishment of any kind. Spanking was defined as physically non-injurious, not causing a bruise, not causing injury, intended to modify behavior, and administered with the open hand to the buttocks or the extremities, smacking the back of the hand, for example. Using strict definitions prevented the common mistake of mixing abusive physical punishment with non-injurious spanking. With these definitions, however, the committee could not reach any strong conclusions favouring or opposing a parent's use of disciplinary spanking for children aged 2 to 11 years. So, committee of psychologists are like, is spanking a good thing or a bad thing? Even with this really specific definition, is spanking good or bad for kids between 2 years old and 11 years old? We don't know. We can't decide. Well, maybe one of the reasons they can't decide is because maybe it's fine for 2-year-olds and not fine for 11-year-olds. Maybe that's possible. Central to the conference was the exhaustive review of the literature on corporal punishment presented by clinical psychologist Robert Lazarere. He found stronger evidence of beneficial rather than detrimental effects of non-abusive spanking by parents with preschool children aged 2 to 6 years. He goes on, developmental research indicates that optimal outcomes in children resulted from an authoritative style of parenting, where parents were in authority, they were in control, that combines positive encouragement with consistent behavioral control of the young child. Young children need correction and punishment, but this is often ignored by the opponents of physical punishment. Timeout and disapproval are effective tools, but are not sufficient to control all problem behavior with all children. Maybe some kids need no spanking ever. Other kids probably need very occasional spanking. But then you have your strong-willed children, and spanking is an essential tool, otherwise they will turn into violent criminals. To remove spanking from the repertoire of parents of young children could promote child abuse and lead to increased violence among older, unruly children. This seems from statistics to be an effect that the Swedish ban has had on that society. If kids are left totally out of control when they're 2, they don't necessarily grow out of it. Perhaps it's more likely that they stay out of control and they become really violent, dangerous teenagers. That was from Trumbull. He's a pediatrician. So you can't just ban corporal punishment. You also need to promote programs like Triple P, positive parenting, in Australia. Sounds great. Next, who do we have piling on Waterston? It's really hard to be an academic. You put yourself out there, and the job of everyone else you know is to criticize your work. Hayne piles on. Occasional smacking does no harm, he says. The evidence cited by Waterston has shown that smacking has adverse effects only when it's excessive. There is no evidence that occasional smacking is harmful, and indeed it would be astonishing if they were, given the trivial nature of the physical and psychological event. There are even theoretical reasons to suppose that smacking may be less harmful than some alternative strategies. It is, after all, quickly over and avoids protracted emotional withdrawal, like, I won't love you if you're naughty, which for many parents is the alternative. So why does Waterston oppose it so strongly? Perhaps because his experience is that for many parents, smacking is not a measured or consistent strategy. Instead, it's a last resort when control is lost. It is the element of unpredictable, irrational, and potentially uncontrolled violence that is dangerous in smacking rather than the smack itself. By definition, this element will not be influenced by changing the law. In recommending legislation against smacking, Waterston ensures that chaotic, uncontrolled smacking will continue, and that only measured smacking, which does no harm and may even help a child understand discipline, will stop. In other words, he will have reached the reverse of his intention. Hayne is grappling with the problem of how do we stop abusive behavior? And Hayne is saying it's not by turning parents like me into criminals. Who else do we have? Fry. Parents must be in charge of their children. He is even gentler on Waterston. I also believe professionally and personally that it is important for parents to be in charge of their children. In this sense, the use of physical punishment is qualitatively different from sexual abuse. Yeah, well, genius. There is a benign aim in the use of punishment that cannot be said to exist in child sexual abuse. Haynes says, parents need to be more powerful than children in the hierarchical structure that we call family. He's a child and family psychiatrist. The parent is the boss of the family. The parent must command respect. And now, Waterston gets his right of reply. The editor clarifies, a key part of the case against a ban on corporal punishment is the desire to distinguish between injurious and non-injurious smacking, causing injury, not causing injury. In legal terms, this is not possible, as a smack on any part of the body is potentially injurious, whatever the intention. Potentially, if you smacked a kid hard enough on their bum, you could break their spine. I don't know, like, what is he talking about? How hard would that have to be? It's just really hard to write these laws in a way that protects kids from actual abuse. In the light of that, Waterston gives some answers. He gives a long answer to Lazzolari and says, these outcomes were short-term only and in artificial situations. He's saying the studies didn't run long enough and no one actually smacks like that. Smacks like what, you ask? Parents were trained to give 2 spanks while being observed by a therapist, and it would not be wise to draw general conclusions in relation to the population of smacking parents. He says most parents don't smack like that. And, you know, maybe that's true, but that's kind of all he has to say about Lazzolari's papers. Trumbull attempts to distinguish between abusive physical punishment and non-injurious spanking. I do not believe that this is practicable in law. The increasing trend in reports of youth assaults in Sweden is at least partly attributable to increased enforcement. Not just youth are more violent because they were never spanked, but youth are being caught more in Sweden because of increased enforcement. He's not making the point very strongly. I agree with Hayne that there is no evidence that occasional smacking is harmful, and it provides a model to the child. Is the practice of violence by parents against a small child a good model to learn from? Waterston can see that the psychological literature isn't very strongly making the point that occasional smacking is bad. And so he kind of slips into the philosophical, I feel like that's just a bad model for parents to be to their children. So I found the conversation in this paper really interesting because you see the kinds of arguments that legitimate psychologists and psychiatrists and pediatricians have over whether smacking is beneficial or harmful or kind of neutral. Proper experts debate this. And the next time you hear someone say, oh, well, everyone knows the evidence is conclusive that smacking is bad, what they've been reading is that the evidence is conclusive that corporal punishment is associated with delinquency. Corporal punishment includes physical abuse. But what I'm really interested in is what's the effect of smacking on my children? From my experience, I don't know how I would manage without smacking my strong-willed child. I hope this survey of academic papers has been useful to you. Well, you're still here, aren't you? I hope it inspires you to be more consistent, even when people are watching you and judging you. And I hope we can all get along a bit better, knowing that we all want actual abusers to be caught and punished, and we want to protect their children. I don't recommend corporal punishment to families. If you chose a corporal punishing family and circumstance at random from somewhere in the world, I would probably take issue with what they were doing or how they were doing it. I might disagree a lot and be really concerned for the children and the family, or I might have some pointers for improvement, and I feel really condescending just saying that. I think my solution would usually be to be converted. You must be a Christian to raise a Christian. What are people objecting to when they're horrified that I smack my children? They're concerned about severe pain and children who feel unloved. Social workers want a clear-cut, legally enforceable standard by which they can protect the kids that need protecting. That's hard. Abusers are generally experts in gaming the legal system. I believe that abusers should live in fear of the system. They should live in fear of their neighbours reporting them. And most of all, they should live in terror of a holy God who is the Father of us all. So I don't go around recommending that people smack their children. I'm not an expert in your child. You are. And I would hate to embolden an actual abuser who goes on to injure their child. This channel is not about me telling you that you need to do things exactly how I do them with my eldest child or my second child. This channel is about me giving you parenting tools and showing you how I use those tools in my house so you can go and make a good decision for your own children. Having said that, I am a proponent for a very specific kind of corporal punishment called non-injurious smacking for, let's say, ages 2 to 6, in conjunction with a variety of non-physical discipline. It should form part of a warm relationship, positive teaching, and punishment for antisocial behavior. So it's not good enough just to tell people to smack their kids, because that in isolation is ineffective. Anti-smackers generally cannot imagine a family that has warm relationships, positive parenting, and smacking. I like to joke that I'm a gentle parent who smacks her children because, according to 2 Samuel 17 verses 14 and 15, good discipline combines punishment with mercy. And one of the reasons that I've made my peace with smacking in public is so that people my age and younger can be exposed to that kind of healthy family discipline that maybe they never saw in their home. Looking at this research has also given me a lot more confidence in smacking well, and I hope it helps you to emphasize with anti-smackers. It's difficult to write laws that prevent abuse. That's all for today on The Well-Trained Child.